Recently, a new button showed up on the toolbar in Microsoft Lists called Forms, and I wondered, how is this any different than the integration button that we already have? Turns out Forms does serve a different and very useful purpose. Let's say you have a Microsoft list where you want to gather a little bit of data from your colleagues, but you don't want them to edit everything on the list. What people normally do is they create a Microsoft form and then they transfer the data to the list through Power Automate. You don't have to do that anymore. If all you're doing is transferring data from forms to lists, you no longer need Power Automate. The Forms button is going to integrate that function for you. So let's click on the Forms button in the toolbar to walk through an example of how to set this up. A floating dialog box will appear, and if this is the first time you've come here, then all you're going to see is the option to create a new form. The first thing you want to do is give the form a title and a description. It's not going to automatically inherit this information from the underlying list. By default, all of the fields are selected and will appear on the form, but in our scenario, we only want our colleagues to submit some of the information. So if you go to the right-hand side of the floating dialog box, you can choose which fields to show or hide. So in this example, the support team will fill in the fields for assigned to and status. So I'm going to deselect both of those boxes. And while I'm here, the email address was the last column I added, so it's at the bottom of the form. But I think it makes more sense to put it next to the employee name. So I'm just going to drag and drop it where I want it to go on the form. The next thing you can customize is the theme. Now, when you first click on this, you'll see 4 standard choices. If you click through and don't like any of them, you can select Create Your Own Style, and then click the drop down next to each of them for additional choices. Let's navigate back to our options and then go to Settings. The Settings menu option on the right-hand side of the floating dialog box is where you can click a toggle button to decide if you are accepting responses to the form and therefore responses to your list. You can also customize your confirmation message. So in this example, I might want to add a few more details, such as when people can expect a response from their request. Now that we've looked at all the customize options, just like in a regular form, we can go to the preview button in the upper right corner of the dialog box, and we can see what the form is going to look like for our intended audience. And I realize I'm missing a question. So I'm going to go back to the form so that I can make some edits. When we make a change to this form, it's also going to add that field to the Microsoft list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Add New Field. A bubble will pop up with the available choices. In this example, I'm going to choose person because the field that is missing is the supervisor's name who is going to approve this particular action. In these scenarios, I'm a fan of the people field because it makes the person choose a name that is in the global address list for the organization. While I'm here, I'm going to click the toggle button for required that's on the right-hand side of the form, and I'm also going to do the same thing for email address. Now, as a tip, I'd like to point out that I cannot make the employee name column required, and the reason for that is because this is a rename of the title field that is automatically created when the list was created, and there are settings in the background that does not allow you to make changes to this particular column. Therefore, any information that is required should not be in the title column. Our form is ready, so let's see how we can send it to our colleagues. Click on Send a Form and notice that people within the organization can respond, and all you have to do is copy a link. It will automatically be added to your clipboard, and then you can send it to people via Teams, email, whatever makes sense for your business process. However, it's important to know that you're not going to have granular control over who can respond like you do have in Microsoft Forms. Now, I'm always a big fan of testing things to make sure they work, so I'm going to submit a response to this particular form. And when we get to action, I'd like to point out that the 2 choices you have here are coming from the choice column in the list. So if you need additional options, you need to update the list. Then I'm going to add in the supervisor's name and submit the form. The thank you message that we customized earlier is showing as intended. So now I'm going to navigate back to list to make sure that the data updated, but first I'm going to need to refresh. And sure enough, everything is in there as intended. Now, another thing that I'd like to point out is notice this thing that says required info. That is showing up because I made the supervisor's column required after somebody had already submitted their information. So you're just going to have to go in and update that if you make something required after data has already been submitted. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that I was curious about how Forms is different than Integrate, so I'm going to very quickly show the difference here. In the toolbar at the top of the list, you see the Integrate button. When you click that, you'll see Power Apps and the option to customize forms. This is going to take you to the Power App Studio, and what it allows you to do is change the form that appears when you choose to edit an item on the list. Without going too deep in Power Apps, the important thing to know is that you can change what is shown on the edit screen, and you can remove things if you don't need them, such as in my example, I don't allow attachments, so I can remove that. You can do things like changing the layout, reordering the fields, or even just add a background color. If you want me to do a video that talks more about these options, let me know in the comments below. But now that we've made our changes, I'm going to click the Save button in the upper right-hand corner, and then I'm going to click on the Publish button. A dialog box is going to pop up letting you know that you're publishing to SharePoint. And then you'll click the Back to SharePoint button on the left-hand side of the screen. It always asks you to confirm that you're ready to leave Power Apps, and then it will return you to your SharePoint list. It can take several minutes for the Power App to connect to the list. Usually you just have to refresh a few times, but in today's case, it actually was an extreme example where it took over an hour to connect. But once the connection is made, select an item and then go to the toolbar and select Edit. Then you will see a pane that opens up from the right-hand side of the screen, and it's going to look like the form that we customized in Power Apps versus the standard form that you would normally see. So the difference between selecting Forms in the toolbar versus clicking Integrate Customize Form is that Forms lets you create a way to gather information from people without giving them access to the whole list. Integrate is a useful option to customize what people see when they are editors of the list.